It's been a while since I've done a podcast. I've just had a surgery about 8 days ago or so, and am still in some pain. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was simply to be a small surgical biopsy, but it turned into a full-blown surgery to remove a tumor in my back, which in all likelihood is benign. But they evidently had to scrape a little deeper than they anticipated, hence the recovery is a little longer. So today is the first day I'm driving my car and weaned off of meds enough to feel more pain, but be a little more cognizant of what I'm doing, and came out to McDonald's and got 2 plain hamburgers with nothing on them and a small coffee. Calorie content actually is quite low, and so it works for me. And for some crazy reason, it tasted really good. I say all that to say that life is always a surprise, and we have very little control over a great deal. We who are Americans don't like that loss of control. We are used to having, most of us, not all of us, sufficient income to meet any emergency, or at least address it, if nothing else, for a loan. We have contingencies that we can take care of. Insurance is often will step in. But we find ways to plan for disaster, and we spend a lot of time in our thinking is about just that. What might befall us that's negative, and how can we offset it? We do that at a national level. Much of our country, honestly, is extremely anxious about security. I'm not saying that we don't have reasons to be. We do. It's a really dangerous world, far more than even the one I grew up in. I will never forget the night that I first became aware of the world larger than my family. I was sitting on a couch. It was late at night, closing in on midnight, I believe, or 9 o'clock or something. I don't know. But it was past my bedtime, and my parents and brother and sister were huddled around a TV listening to and watching JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, announce the blockade on Cuba. All I knew as I fell asleep that night is that my world had changed, and I may not wake up in the morning, for we may be inundated with nuclear war. Now, the truth is, that narrative has never left my generation, and to this day drives much of our foreign policy, much of our expenditures of income. And, again, our enemies are real. Beyond that, it honestly is the United States acting in concert with its allies that, in some sense, keeps this chaotic world from exploding on itself. Now, there would be many who would disagree with that, and that's fine. My point isn't about the politics, but about the anxiety inside the politics. We are the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world, and yet by all accounts that I have heard from those who travel abroad, we are also by far the most anxious. This Sunday, the liturgical text upon which the entire world communion of those who follow Christ, those who are at least in the liturgies, will be on Luke chapter 12, I think beginning around verse 13. Luke is a radical gospel. He evidences this kingdom of God theology, and from the beginning to the end, he turns the world upside down. He notes how women play significant roles in the life of Jesus, all the way from Mary and the mother of Jesus, and her poverty, and in her poverty, birthing and incarnating the very presence of God. But it's much larger than that. He begins with the story of Elizabeth and Zechariah, and Elizabeth, very much like drawing from an Old Testament story from the book of Samuel, chapter 1, of, I can't even remember her name. It's not Sarah, but whoever that was childless and older, and she dedicated Samuel, the future prophet, to God. So the role of women within the Lukean tradition is strong. They're the ones who first discovered Jesus of Nazareth resurrected. They're the ones who remain faithful to the cross. They're the ones who finance his ministry. Johanna, who is the wife of Cusa, who is literally the prime minister over Herod Antipas's tetrarch in Galilee. Just incredible underlining. And then he focuses on the poor over the rich. The parables you will have, about every other parable is turning that whole idea. Now, in this story of the rich fool, you see an interesting twist to his theme of poverty overcoming wealth. In fact, Luke is descriptive when you're doing the Sermon on the Mount, which is just a few chapters before this. He doesn't say poor in spirit. He says the poor have the kingdom of God with them. Those who mourn are comforted. Those who do not feed will be well fed. And conversely, those who are rich now should be aware because the presence of God may not be with you in like measure. So that's his theme. But when he comes to this text in Luke 12, he's talking about Jesus being interrupted by a younger brother, and we know it has to be younger brother just because of the context when he says, force my brother to share the wealth with me. Now, the reason that has to be is that it was the elder brother who in those tribal communities typically held all the authority, held the power, held the money, and the responsibility with that. The younger brother had to make sure that all the younger siblings were taken care of when the father and mother passed. He took care of the parents when they were too old to take care of themselves. He had the financial responsibility of managing the extended family because they didn't think in terms of individuals, they thought in terms of their familial groups. And so if you have a younger brother coming to the rabbi Jesus, an itinerant rabbi seeking justice, it is because this younger brother feels that his elder brother is not managing well, is not being generous and considerate, but is in fact building barns for himself rather than his family. We in the West, all my life, have assumed that the next parable that Jesus tells, which is about a man who had a great crop and thought to himself, I don't have room to store this beautiful crop. So what will I do? I will build myself bigger barns, and I will build bigger crops, and I will store them all in my bigger barns, and then I will be at rest and eat, drink, and I'll have the American good life, etc. And Jesus said, you're a fool. Because today you're going to be faced with the Creator and you will not be able to take your wealth with you. Now, I've always interpreted that growing up, and I think most Americans do, coming from a place of economic privilege, as an indictment against the younger brother who confronted Jesus with an issue of injustice. Jesus' response to him, and the reason we think that is who am I to judge between you and your brother? And then Jesus tells that parable. It's just as likely that rather than negating the younger brother, he was really, in essence, saying, I'm not your judge. I don't know the circumstances. Indeed, it may be that your elder brother, you have a case against him. I'm not the place to go to solve that. And then he makes an interesting statement just before he tells the parable. He says, life does not consist in wealth. And he adds, even if you're very wealthy. Now, why does he add that? I think he adds it because he genuinely is not taking a position between whether the younger brother or the older brother is in the right. He's simply advising that he's turning on its head several things. One, the idea that if you're wealthy, it's because God is blessing you. That was a paradigm, it was a belief system in ancient tradition, certainly in Israel. Often today it's expressed in American Christianity in subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle if you watch TBN, Trinity Broadcasting Network. But so he was turning that on its head. But what he was really turning on his head is just a reflective statement about the nature of wealth and how anxiety over wealth, whether we are poor or rich, is destructive. Now, my point, if we are privileged, as really I am, I should not write myself out of this story thinking this is for the young man who thought his circumstances were unjust. I should see myself in the story because of that phrase that Jesus makes, and because we really don't know where the injustice was here. Let's assume for the moment the elder brother was greedy, was not taking care of the younger brother's needs, and the younger brother had a point. In that case, what he was failing to do is do what Israel failed to do, which was be generous with the blessing of life, with the gift given of knowing God, the relationship with God being the most important gift we possess, that we are each and all as a community, as individuals, valuable to the Creator. And we are to manage wealth for God, not for ourselves. We are to give it away to others who have need, and not for ourselves. And that's an indictment on the whole of Israel. It's an indictment certainly on anybody who's part of an empire, such as we are in the American Empire, and such as Luke's audience, many were. They were Roman citizens, many of them. He was not a Jew. He was a Greek who was writing the ancient history of the church. So much of his audience would have been Roman. But it's also true for those who are marginalized. The final thing we need to note is much of the audience that Luke was writing to, in fact, were marginalized. They were persecuted now by the Jewish community. The separation had largely taken place by the time of the publication of this letter. Or at least it was on the edge of taking place, and they were now vulnerable to Rome and the gods of Rome, because they were no longer under the protection that had been afforded the Jewish community, negotiated between the Jewish community and Rome itself, that their service of the one God would not be prosecuted. That held up to about 200-something AD. Christians were made illegal sometime after 100 AD and came outside, or were no longer perceived as Jewish and therefore no longer protected. And so it is a vulnerable community to which this story is being told. So the message to all of us is pretty simple. Life does not consist in wealth. Life consists in being rich toward God. Now, if we are inside a marginalized community, that means that we desperately need to hold on to that truth, so that when we confront injustice, we are doing it out of generosity, out of a sense of obligation for the next generation, and we are not doing it and not compelled out of our own sense of envy over the stresses created by the majority population. Now, I say that cautiously as a white man that does in fact have privileges that I see that people of color, many, do not have, even in modern America. But equally conversely, on the opposite side of that, the message is to us who share in the wealth of this country that wealth is not life. And the anxiety we experience is in fact destructive of life. And that we are to use wealth to be generous toward others, especially those who have less. That if we are living into the kingdom of God, we are literally setting a part of our income aside so that we are dedicating it to organizations that will address systemic wealth issues. In other words, if you are a white person in America, middle class, you probably benefited from your parents owning a home, or something that was passed on to you, or a capacity and access to loans and trust given that lets you prosper. That's not true for everyone, obviously, but it's largely true. And in ways that those who are born within marginalized communities in the United States don't have the same access to wealth formation or wealth transference. Therefore, if we put ourselves in this story, we are the older brother. And if we own a business, we pay fair living wages where one person's work supports a family. That's a radical thought. Or where if we are employed and we have two of us working in order to sustain our wealth, we make sure part of that is set aside, not just for our future posterity, but a portion of that is set aside for those who do not have access to those means. That's the message at a practical level. It's a message that we have to be rich towards God, because money, and the anxiety, more importantly, about it, eats away all of our souls. Anyway, God bless you as you come into this Sunday, and if you're part of the larger